Thank you all so much for coming. I feel like we're a very special group to have braved this daunting weather, to be here together. And it's very appropriate because tonight we have a very special speaker who is Dante Marioni. For those of you who may not be aware, Dante is one of the most admired and respected glassblowers anywhere, and that means worldwide. I would even go so far as to say that he has a cult following, but I don't want to embarrass him. So all I will say is that as a person and as an artist, he is exceptional in every way. And if you don't get enough of Dante tonight, he will be blowing at the museum studio tomorrow from 10 to 2, and I invite you all to come watch him. Please don't miss it. You'll be glad that you saw him. It's really great. In regards to his artwork, Dante considers himself a traditionalist, and he has, in fact, learned glassblowing in the most traditional way possible. Unlike many artists working in glass today, Dante is not the product of a university or art school program. He has learned his craft from American and Italian master glassblowers, primarily Lino Pietra and Benjamin Moore. Dante was not, however, your typical apprentice. He grew up in a family of influential artists and intellectuals that includes his father, Paul Marioni, a respected artist and pioneer of the American studio glass movement, his uncle, Joseph Marioni, a painter in New York, and another uncle, Tom Marioni, a well-known performance artist in Northern California. As Dante has told me, he spent his childhood listening to discussions about movements and trends in contemporary art. He thought that these kinds of conversations were normal. But most importantly, I think, his worldview was shaped by artists to which he owes much of his success. Dante remembers seeing his father and his friends blow glass in the early years, but he was too young to appreciate what they were doing and to understand the newness of studio glass working, not to mention Paul and his friends' rebellious brand of it. His father's friends, who were all artists, definitely influenced me, Dante says. I think my education has been from being around leaders of the studio glass movement, like Dick Marquis, Fritz Dreisbach, and Marvin Lepofsky. It was a big advantage that most people in glass do not have, and I was very lucky. Dante had his first solo show in Seattle in 1987, and I think it's accurate to say that his success was immediate. Now his work is represented in museums worldwide, from Auckland, New Zealand to Stockholm, Sweden. Some of the museums who own his work include the Carnegie, the Chrysler Museum of Art, Victoria and Albert Museum in London, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Seattle Art Museum, the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne, the Toledo Museum of Art, the New Orleans Museum of Art, the National Museum of Modern Art in Tokyo, the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney, and of course, the Corning Museum of Glass, the Museum of Arts and Design in New York, and the Smithsonian's Renwick Gallery in Washington. This is not Dante's first trip to Corning. Many of you are familiar with the glass that he has designed for Steuben, but it is a memorable one, not because of the weather, but because we have him to ourselves tonight, and he's going to tell us about his work. Please welcome Dante.
Wow. Gee, I don't have much else to say after that. Thanks. I'm really flattered to be here. I'm really flattered that everybody, well, that anybody came. The weather and everything. And as Tina said, I have spent a lot of time here over the years, mostly in the service of doing stuff with students. Sorry, I have a little bit of hoarse voice. Actually, a lot of hoarse voice. So bear with me. But anyway, typically I'm here around this time of year for a snowstorm to do work in the student plant and stuff like that. And this is kind of nice this time when I can bring a sports coat. I don't have to blow back. Oh no, I do have to blow glass. Tomorrow, actually. But I'll give you just a little bit of background of myself and then a brief description of what I'm going to project here for you guys. This is my second PowerPoint presentation. I had this bag of filthy, dirty slides that I've been traveling around the world with for years. Not filthy, dirty like you might be thinking. And I've recently converted them onto the little disc, and my son helped out with a 12-year-old son with getting me hooked up with the digitizing everything. But anyway, I started blow glass when I was 15 years old. My dad, as Tina said, was one of the pioneering hippies that blew glass in the 70s. California, excuse me. And throughout the 1970s, my father attended the Pilchuck School up in the Pacific Northwest. And every year he'd come home and say, we're going to move to Seattle. We lived in the San Francisco Bay Area at that time, and it was, you know, a lot of drama to hear that because, like, my sister and I like living in California quite a bit. Eventually, in 1979, he made it happen. If you've ever been to the Northwest in the summertime, it's fabulous. And then it rains until July. And anyway, so when I was 15 years old, we moved up there, and I started to blow glass right away. And I think it's important for me to tell you guys that because, well, first of all, I hear all kinds of different stories about when I actually started, between 9 and 19, blah, blah, this, that, and the other. But I started to do it because I had the opportunity through Dad's friends in Seattle at that time that had one of 3 hot shops in the state of Washington. There's now probably 200. And it was just fun. I just did it for fun. And at 15 years old, I had no career aspirations whatsoever. And by the time high school was concluding, I was 18 years old. I was 3 years into this, and I was really committed. And I was probably about 35 years old before I realized how fortunate I was to know what I wanted to do when I grew up, before I had totally grown up, because I would encounter kids or people that I grew up with that still didn't know what they wanted to do when they grew up. They were totally grown up. And I was in the right place at the right time, like nobody else ever has been, as far as I'm concerned. The situation in Seattle in the 1980s was just booming. And I was able to latch on to people who I really admired and go with it, you know. Like I said, by the time I was out of high school, I was completely committed to doing this. Not necessarily that I wanted to be a studio glass artist per se. I just liked blowing glass still. It was still just a fun thing for me to do, and I was able to do it professionally. I worked in a studio, in a production glassblowing studio, until I was about 23 years old. I did 5 years after high school, and I stayed after work and practiced and went in on the weekends and was able to round up a crew of people my age, which actually there's a story in that as well. And in addition to that, my dad and I built a little tiny hot shop, and I kind of have taken it over from him. And that's where I still have that same studio in Seattle, this smallish hot shop where we make most of the work that I do. Anyway, I had 3 friends from high school who I was able to convince that they would find happiness as glass blowers as well. Preston Singletary, Paul Cunningham, and Joey DeCamp, and they all 3 are in Seattle doing their own respective things. But at that point in time, in the early 80s when I was starting out, that was a really big deal because I was the youngest person in any glass studio I ever went into. It was really difficult for me to convince people to help me out. So I managed to convince my friends from the neighborhood, really, and we created this sort of team. We all helped each other. Throughout our very late teens and into our 20s, we all worked together, and that was a really big part of me being able to move forward the way that I have. So my slides that I have here, I have some images of the people that have been the biggest influences on me, responsible for me being able to participate really, in truth. And then I have some images of some objects that have been inspirational to me because I think it's important. I like to hear what people, where they're coming from, at the risk of having the work be completely demystified, which can ruin it. It's happened to me. I've sat through slide presentations and left no longer liking somebody's work because they described it too good and it didn't leave anything to the imagination. And I'm probably going to do that tonight, so sorry. But so I have some images of some objects that have inspired me, which I just like to show that so you have some examples of where I'm coming from. And then a whole bunch of some images of just kind of typical objects that I've made, and then the newer stuff that I've done, the most recent work, and some other different projects. So first and foremost is my family. This is my wife Allison and my boy Lino, who's 12. So this is a pretty old picture. And we don't live in that cool lighthouse, but it would be sweet if we did. And this is a typical day, not far from my house. It could have been in June, or it could have been in December or February, I'm not sure. But that's what it's like. This is my father, Paul Marioni. He has a studio in the same building where my studio is, and we share a love of motorized things. And this is a motorcycle that we've had for a while together. And I don't really have to go into too much detail on the influence that my father's had on me, because in addition to just simply being my dad, he's also was my introduction into this. And I made a lot of different choices over the years in terms of, I shouldn't really say it that way. It's, my dad and I are just kind of cut from different cloth when it comes to the things that we like and the direction. Like the direction that I went, based on what I've been exposed to, was completely different than what he's done. And I think that's great, you know, that I hope my kid ends up doing the same thing. Not necessarily that he's going to do glass, but, you know, I was able to see and experience all these different things through what my dad was able to offer me, and go with something else, or just a different direction. I mean, we both have objects in this building, which is a really cool thing for me. But they're a lot different. You wouldn't recognize, you wouldn't guess that a father and son made these things. My dad has a younger brother, Joseph Marioni. He's a painter in New York City. He's been a huge influence on me. He doesn't have kids of his own, and was always just an outstanding uncle, and exposed me to artwork and different things from a really young age. My dad likes to say, or has said, and my sister and I have said, why can't you be more like Uncle Joe? And he says, it's a lot easier to be an uncle than it is to be a dad. And I've gotten to use that line a few times myself lately. The work of Richard Marcus, he's somebody who I've known since I was a little kid in California. He lives in the Northwest now, but he was originally from the Bay Area. He was a friend of Dad's from the early 70s, and I was exposed to his work when I was probably 9 or 10 years old. And by the time I was in my early 20s, we started to work together. We remained really close friends, and he's been a huge influence over the years. He's really well represented in this museum at the moment. There's a bunch of pieces in the Heinemann collection of Dick's. We're enthusiastic collectors. And in addition to in the permanent collection, my dad's not in the room tonight, is he? No, Dick's my favorite glass artist. And I'm not related to. How's that? And then the work of Benjamin Moore. When I was a kid in Seattle, one of the people that I was exposed to through my dad was this guy who had a completely different approach to everybody else that was making funky, spun open, goopy stuff. And that's Benjamin Moore. He was making these very clean, he took a completely design perspective on the studio glass thing. And additionally, he was able to blow glass on center at will. That was a really, really rare thing. Like 1980, it was a handful of people in the United States, a couple, that could, every time they picked up a pipe and made an object, that it came out symmetrical. Very, very few people. And I was really enamored with that. I was like, oh my gosh, that's more how I'm thinking than all this other loose stuff. And in addition to me really relating to his aesthetic, he was really kind and accepting of a pesky teenager, which I was. So he's sort of been as much of a mentor as I've ever really had in a glass sense, I think. But of course, the fabulous Lino then came along and changed everything. And I met Lino in 1983 through Benny. He would come to Pilchuck. In 1983, Lino didn't speak any English. So he would come to, it was his third visit to the United States in 1983, and he came to the studio that I worked at. And it was phenomenal. I didn't realize this till much later, how fortunate I was, but, well, I knew how fortunate I was right away, but nowadays when you see Lino make work, if you're lucky enough to see him build glass, he makes his own work, which is great, you know, because you watch him make a dinosaur or a Bilbao or whatever he does. But back in 1983 when he came in, he did things like this. He made a cup, a plate, a vase, a bowl, another cup, a different plate, another bowl. Just ran through this smorgasbord of offhand, perfect Venetian, traditional Venetian glass pieces. And for somebody who's just a sponge for this kind of information, it was golden. You know, it was such an advantage that kids don't get anymore, to see a proper master glass blower running through all the classics, you know. And as great as it is to watch him, I mean, now when I watch him blow glass making his own work, I can glean things from what it is that he does. But Lino doesn't really understand when he comes and teaches a workshop or whatever, or demonstrates anywhere, why after he leaves, everybody's making pieces that look like his, because that's what they see him do, and everybody wants to be like him. So I wanted to be like him too, but I ended up making stuff like that and not stuff like his artwork, which he hadn't really thrown himself into that much at that point. And I don't really have much else to say. I don't really know, have the words or feel lucid enough to put it into words how influential he's been, but I believe he's sort of single-handedly responsible for making everything rise up faster than anybody else possibly could have, including Dante Marioni, really. 1983 at the Glass High Studio in Seattle, Washington, and that was Benjamin Moore in the middle, and Lino obviously sitting down, and Richard Royal, and then I was the helper kid there. A pretty significant, a defining moment in my young life, actually, to be able to witness, and as I just said. And from here, I basically started to make wine glasses. That was the thing that actually Lino actually did mention to me through Benjamin, that if you made wine glasses with the same person for 7 years, you'd be able to make anything. And I think that's an oversimplification. But I took it to heart, and I did my best. I didn't set out for that 7-year thing, but I had these guys that worked with me, and I was able to really practice. And making wine glasses is a really great way to learn about a lot of things in glass blowing. Proportion, I mean, first and foremost, skill. They're small and fast, and you go through a lot of them in a day, and you figure out proportion, and I never really pursued it other than as kind of a hobby. Like, I made things for myself, like those colored cups. This was sort of an homage to the 7 best cups I'd made up to that point. I soaked them in acid and had this box built. This is more a recent piece that I did. On rare occasions, we melt blue glass. So anyway, I would do this, actually, pretty much up until the time my kid was born. I used to blow glass quite a bit, and once my son was born, I really backed off. I didn't feel like working all the time, or going into the studio just to goof around and make wine glasses, because that's not what I did for a living. I would go in and do what I do, make my work, and then I came home. So most of these things are around 12 years old. This is this goofy chandelier I did. These people approached me in the city of Tacoma, which is Delta Louis' hometown. They were developing a building, these developers, and they said that they had longtime fans of my work, which I knew was baloney. And they wanted me to build a light, a chandelier for this building, and I'd never done or even entertained the idea of doing anything like it. And so I took the meeting with them, and I pitched them this idea based on this installation of goblets that I had I had a show at the time where I had the meeting with them, the gallery in Seattle, and I had a display of this wall display of all these goblets. I don't have an image of them, I'm sorry, but while I sat there listening to them, I kind of, literally on a napkin, drew this idea, and they were like, that's great, that's just what we had in mind. But really, they just liked my price point way better than at your really chandelier. And I think, I'm proud of it. It's an interesting object. As you can see, it's just made out of green goblets, but it will look cooler in a bar than it does in a building. And now, once in a while, I go look at it, and there's people that flick pennies into it, stuff like that. Anyway, and then I built this, when I would make the goblets all the time, they just got piled into boxes in my studio, or a box, I should say, that was of these dimensions, 2 foot tall, or 2 foot by 1 foot square. The box was laying on its side. And after passing it for years, I got the idea to build this end table for my house, which is what this was. I fancied this as a cool little end table around the time we had a kid, and it was not a practical object to have in the house. So, through making all those goblets, and I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but not really too much, because I like to show this image. This is just a typical stem of a goblet that I made, to sort of underscore how what I do, what I feel I do, and I think more people than would care to admit that blow glass would. I feel that it's process driven in a lot of cases, or you know, any craft material, as you develop skills, you think ahead, and then additionally, as you do things, in the process, from the end of your arms, you see stuff occur that you think might end up somewhere else at some point in time, or inspire you. And in the case of those goblet stems, I created these pieces, which I ended up calling combo vases, which is the Venetian word for a leg or stem of a combo. And they're about 3 foot or a meter, or 36, 39 inches tall. But I'd been making them for a few months before I realized that was it, you know. It was like a little self-realization for me to understand that I was making work in this way and not abstractly fetching stuff out of nowhere, you know. And then additionally, I mentioned before I started that there are some objects that have been really inspirational to me. And this is a piece that I have in my house. I have this child-proof cabinet in my house full of treasures, things I've collected over the years. And this is a piece that was designed by a Swedish artist, a ceramic artist, in about 1938 named Tira Lundgren. She came to the Venetian factory and she created this series of, actually, she was most famous for this series of blown glass fish, which don't work for me at all, but she did a series of these leaf-shaped dishes that I just find really beautiful in their simplicity. And this piece literally inspired me to do these. And though these bear no resemblance to that piece, I don't necessarily set out to recreate anything. It's just having an object to look at, be it in a book or in my living room, is a lot of where things come from. I mean, I guess that's kind of obvious because lots of artists have that same method, but for me, it's pretty literal. You know, there's actually even a particular period, a very specific, I call these leaves as well. And this is a much more recent series that I did, but and they're more of a fiddlehead fern or something like that. But I'm really bad. My wife and the guy that worked with me are my focus group. They look over the stuff that I make, and my wife is really quick to point out that I'm really bad at titling stuff. There's a lot of leaves that you're going to see in the next 15 minutes. Are things that I call leaves that might not look too leafy to you, but anyway, again, you know, that Tira Lundgren dish has been a starting point for me. And there's a period in Venetian glassmaking that, oh, here's a leaf, some leaves that I did about 12 years ago. I worked with William Morris a lot, not a lot, but off and on throughout my youth. I'm just going to assume everybody's pretty familiar with what he does. He's a well-known artist in the Northwest. Everything that he does, he applies the color via powder on the outside of the surface, on the outside of the piece once the object is formed, versus the way somebody like myself or lots of other people typically do it, where you start with a piece of color and then put clear glass over it, inflate it, and that's what you have, or surface embellish it later or whatever. Billy just sifts this like talcum fine powdered colored glass onto a piece, and it's a nasty process if you don't have all the proper equipment. And I really wanted to get it out of my system. I wanted to have a go at doing this, so I made these leaves, which I was really pretty happy with. But the guys that worked with me were not happy about making them because of the powder and the mess and stuff. And lucky for them, they were not. Nobody else was happy with them either. So I still have them. And I always point out that I see, to me, those look like beautiful, graceful leaves floating to the ground, but other people see stomachs and pancreas and stuff like that. So I still have all of them in my studio, and they're super valuable someday. This is another piece that I purchased in an antique store. It's Vittorio Zucchini from probably the late 1920s. Again, a Venetian piece. It's just beautiful little flask, and it's been in my house for years. And I ended up sort of taking it with. These pieces are quite large. A lot of the work that I've done over the years has been pretty big, and they're probably 36, 38 inches tall in some cases. But it was the starting point. It was this. Tina said I had a very traditional sort of training, which I suppose is somewhat true, but I did insofar as, or from the point of view of a studio glass person. I mean, I didn't apprentice in a Venetian glass house or anywhere else for that matter. I pretty much apprenticed at Pilchuck School. And was able to meet everybody through my dad and go and watch other people blow glass, this, that, and the other. But the work that I admire is of a very traditional nature, obviously, from what I'm showing you, like some Martinuzzi piece from 1930. And I guess I've been really hung up on this this period when modernism entered in, came into Venetian glass. The Venetians refer to it as the Novecento, the turn of the last century. They once they got past Art Nouveau, which I kind of personally glossed right over, once it moved into Art Deco and this whole modernist movement took foot in the 1920s that I've been kind of hung up on. And objects like this piece, which I've admired since long before I knew any of this stuff, I just saw it in a book. And I ended up making a series of them. Again, these are probably my favorite things that I've ever done. These 10, I just simply refer to it as a 10-handled vase. This is 1966, Tapio Vercola for the Venini factory. And I have this, he's become one of my artistic heroes. He was invited to come to Venini in the 1960s. And I have this fantasy, I just made this up, but the work that he did prior to coming to Venini, he worked on a lot of different material, like wood, and he designed knives and products, and, you know, he was a product designer, but also an artist, and he did design some work for the finished glass houses, and it was rather clunky. That's not a fair word. It was thick and crystally, and it was basically, he worked around their skills. I don't know that that's what he was thinking, but the Finnish guys couldn't have pulled this off. And I have this idea that he might have shown up there in Milano and seen what the Venetians were up to, and then designed these objects around their skills, because nobody else could have put together pieces like this at that time, or probably at any time, than these Venetian guys, specifically at the Venini factory. And I have this piece in my house. Lino Pietro gave it to me because he was 100%, he's at 99.9% sure it was made by the greatest glassmaker of the 20th century. It was a Venetian guy named Mario Barassa. So Lino gave it to me so I have a good example. And it's, in essence, this very simple piece. The technique of putting two bubbles together is called incalmo. You join two pieces of bubbles together to create the different bands. In this case, this is a piece I made. And there's a detail of, you know, a reticello in between the bands of the piece. Anyway, there's more work that I'll show in a little bit that Tapio Vercola has inspired. But, and that last piece I just showed you skips right ahead, because throughout the 1990s, this is typical of the works that I did, was these large, colorful, and the last decade as well, large, colorful vessels. And the influences come from all different kinds of things, but primarily other glass objects that I've seen. I mean, obviously the bowl, which is kind of a kylix in the middle, is of Greek origin, but the pitcher and the flask are of things that I've seen, probably not necessarily in real life as a glass piece, but in an old master's still life or something like that. There's a lot of great depictions of Venetian glass in those Dutch paintings. And these are sort of updated versions of those kind of signature objects, the pitcher and the bowl that I did. And different vessels that I've pretty much staked the vessel up until, I've made a few different sculptural objects I'll get to, but for the most part, I've been very vessel-centric. This is a pretty recent piece that I did with these leafy handles, or leaves, not handles. And about 10 years ago, I started to, for the first time, I put those slides in because it's, as I said, typical of all the work that I've done up to that point, and all that stuff was a decoration that hadn't really been a part of what I was doing. I've been really enamored with the form as a glass blower. That's the challenge. The color was really the easy part, to be honest. It's the easiest part of doing this is applying the color, particularly the way that I do it, when it's just a simple big chartreuse pitcher with black trim or something. It's as minimal as it gets technically. And about 10 years ago, I started to embrace the idea of doing some different sort of traditional filigree and Zamfirical stuff, and you can't really see from this, but I started to make the reticello. Lino Pietro always encouraged me to learn how to do a reticello. I didn't really have any interest in pursuing that because it's so difficult to learn how to do. just in the service of making a wine glass or a dragonstone goblet or something. I didn't take the time, and I was a little too short attention span to focus on doing something like that until I had an idea, and that idea was manifested itself in these pieces, which I refer to as fenestra vases, because fenestra means a window, and all of them have that shoulder that's transparent. In this case, you look through the yellow reticello at the red interior of the piece. And actually, I'll go back to that because these pieces are about a meter high, and in my studio, the work comes back to my studio, back from the cold shop, and I just put it on the floor. They stand up on the floor, or if I have one in my house, that's the way it is. The first time I exhibited them, I got to the gallery, and they were all up on plinths, and you couldn't even see the shoulder, and I was like, that's not the idea. And the dealer said, I'm not putting them on the floor. It's not going to happen. So I lost interest in making them. But from there, it segued into me becoming more interested in working with pattern. And in particular, this reticello thing, I really threw myself into, and I created all these different series. Using this really super fussy, this very exacting technique, it has been the single most challenging thing that I've learned how to do. I think the word master gets really, really overused, and I don't consider myself a master really of anything. But having said that, like being able to put on handles and whatnot, I got pretty good at it. That I could do. But the reticello is like still 50-50. Half the time when we make a big piece that has 120 canes in it, half the time it ends up in the garbage. And, that's a lot. I mean, half the time, pretty much anything you make can end up in the garbage for different reasons. But to do a reticello, for me it has to be perfect. I want a bubble in every little square. I want the whole thing to be in a particular, the angle of the two different twists and stuff like that. So it's been a really, really exhausting endeavor, but great at the same time. And I'm also not inherently superstitious, but when I do come home from work and gloat that I finally figured it out, then I usually fall into a slump. So I'm not gonna, I've had a really good run before I came on this trip. That's all I'm gonna say about that. My dad has some dried opium poppies sitting on his desk in his studio, don't ask me why. And I took one downstairs one day and created this piece. I don't have anything else to say about it, but it's, I just was enamored with the form of this unblossomed, dried out opium poppy. And then the acorn has been something that I've admired since I was a kid. I like the way that it occurs. Well, obviously in nature, as a little boy, picking it up and finding this cool little nut with a beret on it. But in graphics as well, you know, I really enjoy graphic arts and line drawing and whatnot, and the way that the acorn is depicted in graphics is enough for me. I'm not interested in making it anatomically a perfect, true to acorn form acorn. I'm happy to interpret it my own way, and they're instantly recognizable as acorns. It's been a good way for me to explore working with different forms and patterns, and as you can see, like, it was a bit of a departure for me to make work like this, where light came through it. I grew up listening to my dad talk, and lots of other artists talk about how great glass is because it transmits the light. Bertil Berlin famously said, glass eats light, blah, blah, blah. I liked glass because you could blow it. That was pretty much the activity, the tradition, the teamwork, and these are the things that drew me to doing this more so than the obvious alluring aspects of the material. These are some pieces that I did in starting about 15 years ago. Myself and my friend Dick Marcus were really enamored with the work that Carlos Carpa and his son Tobias Carpa made in the 1940s and 50s in Venice, comprised of Marini. And we set about figuring out how to do that. And then ended up going our separate ways. Dick made pieces that way, and I made these things, mosaic vases. And they were, at the time, a real departure because they were, I considered them sort of architectural, and a lot of times look at them as like a building or something with all the little windows and whatnot. And it's been a fun way to explore pattern as well. And I put this image in so to give you an idea of the scale and the, it doesn't, when I make these pieces, there's a team of 7 people that help me out. I no longer make it. I did for for a few years. And about 8 or 9 years ago, I was approached by these folks that had purchased some of my work for some collectors, obviously. They said that they would like to commission me to do something for their house, and that it could be anything that I wanted, and that their fondest wish would be that it would lead me into a new direction. I was just flabbergasted with the generosity of this proposal. I just couldn't believe it. It came in at a good time too. It was around 2002, I guess. Everything kind of slowed down a little bit, and so it gave me something to do. Me and the people in my studio something to do. And I set about making this big wall, all these little pieces. I just showed up at the studio, and all day long we made these pieces were about 8 inches high. And I created this big wall of, I think, 144 objects. It took about a year to finish because while I was doing this, I was inspired to, through an image that I saw in a book that I have at home of the Barovier, the glass of the Barovier. There's an image from about 1920 from the Biennale, where they have these very cool sort of deco objects, vessels lined up on shelves. And they click the picture, it's obviously black and white, but I believe the pieces were probably in clear or in a tinted clear with black details on them. And they're just lined up, a dozen of them on these three shelves with corresponding numbers, and that's the image that's in the catalog. And I just thought it was a really nice way to make a composition, so that's what I did. It took me about an additional 6 months to complete the commission because I kept poaching good ones off the wall. And I made these little units of 12, and I did them in all kinds of different formats or colors. And I no longer do it. We really got sick of making thousands of little 8-inch high pieces. And we're coming to the end here. These are some of the newest works that I've done. Again, the inspiration harkens back to some of the work that Tapio Vertila did. If you're at all familiar with what he did do, he's really well known for this laminated birch wood furniture, and my particular favorite is this dish that he made in 1951 of laminated birch wood that the laminate then created the veins of the leaves, and it inspired me to make those pieces. Inspired me to make these objects, which you can't really tell because they're not here in person, but when you move around them, you see the Morel effect of all the canes. They're quite tall, and again, very much about pattern. They're a real departure for me because they're loose. They're the first thing that I've made where I'm not all that completely concerned if something's just a little bit askew. You know, the foot, for example, on this one, you can see leans off to the right. I like that. And the stem was the first one I did like this, where I then bent the stem to go with it too. Liberated feeling after making stuff on center for so long. And again, it's the Venetian pattern. And these are the last few slides. This is the most current work that I've done. I just have, excuse me. This is something that I did on my own for myself. It's a chandelier, fused glass chandelier. I've always had an interest in lighting and chandeliers and whatnot. It didn't really stem from that kooky goblet chandelier I did. I just, I don't know, it's personal interest, and I made this piece for myself, and it hangs in my partner in my glassblowing studio's apartment because it's 14th ceilings. I don't have a place to keep it. So I don't get to see it that often. But anyway, it's something that, it's an example of a project that's now segued into other things. I've done a couple of large architectural commissions through the Bullseye Glass Company in Portland, Oregon. Sadly, I don't have any images of the pieces because they're relatively recent, but they're not entirely unlike these things. And with any luck, it'll be a new direction for me. As much as I enjoy blowing glass, and it's all I've ever done professionally, I really like the idea of maybe not blowing glass and still working with it. And I'm about to purchase a kiln and have the ability to start doing some experiments of my own. And lastly, I have these images of the work that I did here for Steuben. I think it was about somewhere in 2000, I got a phone call from Joel Smith was one of the design directors up until recently here, and I was at the Pilchuck School, and he called. My wife called and said, "Oh, Stubank called, and they'd like you to consider designing a line of STEM work." And I thought about it for, I don't know, 10 seconds. I said, "No, I don't want to do that." It sounded like a high school homework assignment. As stupid as that sounds, I'm a maker. And when I design things, it happens at the glassblowing bench. It was just a reverse process for me. And at the time, actually, I was at the Pilchuck School in the service of other artists doing their designs. You show up in the morning, they pin a picture on the wall. I go ahead and me and the person I'm working with goes ahead and executes it. So the idea of drawing pictures, mailing them off, and getting prototypes back was just crazy. My wife convinced me it would probably be in our best interest to start diversifying our income base. So I went ahead and pursued it. I sequestered myself in the basement with some beer and a bunch of pens and pencils, and I just drew pictures of goblets, laid them all out, figured out which ones maybe were, it was a process like that, and then used a finer pen on the next round, sent them over here to Corning, and then got yay or nay on some of them. These ones were actually pretty popular, and it led to these candlesticks, that particular stem. And it was a really fun thing to do, and it went from there to where I actually worked over in the hot shop on several occasions. They really wanted me to design some objects that the guys could make there. And I found it really difficult to do that. I wasn't really able, I don't think I was the best person to work for Stubank in that capacity, but I ended up doing okay doing it this way, which I consider to be the hard way. And so anyway, that's STEM, and then these candlesticks. And then finally the champagne bucket, which I always like the irony of it because it's this fragile crystal object that you use in the service of imbibing. You're going to chip it. It's inevitable. You'll have to get another one. And I believe that's my last slide, and I'm really happy to answer any questions that anybody has. Thank you very much. No questions? All right, let's have a drink. Oh, I'm sorry. My dad is, my dad primarily concerns himself, he makes a living primarily by doing architectural commissions in glass. He also makes and exhibits his own artwork, just really slowly. Might have one show every couple of years. But his primary focus really the last 20 years, in terms of his livelihood, has been doing architectural commissions. A lot of public artwork. Here's a beautiful window, a stained glass window we made in 1974. It's here in the museum. And I hadn't seen it until last year, when I was here in December for an activity I was doing. And I hadn't seen it since 1974, that particular window. And when I was a kid, my dad, I remember when he made it, it was purchased by the museum right away, I think. So it was sold, it was up in the studio. It was leaning against the door, which I thought was a really stupid thing for him to do. And then I opened up the door without seeing the stained glass window because it was covered in Grateful Dead posters and stuff. It just blended in. And I just caught the window with my foot like that. It just came out right through my foot. So to see that every time it's bittersweet. He built a lot of stained glass windows in the 1970s. How he started out. Okay. Thanks again.